It's often assumed that when a narcissist loses control, they simply move on. That's rarely what happens. What usually shows up instead is subtle. A shift in tone, a change in energy, something that feels slightly off. Have you ever noticed that moment when the conversation changes, but nothing obvious has happened yet? Not every reaction is aggressive. Some are quiet, confusing, and even after you think you've gained clarity, you can still find yourself second-guessing it. There are patterns to this. In this video, we'll look at what typically happens when a narcissist loses control over you, so you can recognize what's unfolding without losing your footing in the process. I'm Stephen Walters, and I help people communicate with clarity and calm in conversations that matter in a noisy world. And just to say it, this video isn't about diagnosing anyone, and it's not a substitute for professional support. We're simply looking at communication patterns, not labeling people. Because when communication shifts, even subtly, it can affect how steady you feel inside the conversation. And when control starts to slip, certain responses tend to show up. They don't always unfold in a straight line, but they often build on each other if earlier attempts don't work. The first one is usually the most confusing. It's called soft re-engagement. Often when someone feels they're losing control in a relationship, the first reaction isn't explosive. It's not dramatic. It can actually feel quite gentle. You might get a message that says something like, "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," or "I didn't realize how distant we'd become," or even, "I miss how we used to talk." The tone feels different, softer, more reflective, maybe even humble. And if you've recently started pulling back, responding less, setting firmer boundaries, or simply not engaging the same way, the timing can feel almost reassuring. You might think, maybe this is growth. Maybe they finally understand. And sometimes people do grow, but it's worth noticing when the warmth appears. If it shows up right as your distance increases, that's not random. When influence feels like it's slipping, restoring connection is often the first instinct. Not necessarily to repair the relationship, but to restore access to it. Access to your time, your emotional space, your attention. You don't have to judge it right away. Just notice the shift and notice when it happened. But if the warmth doesn't bring things back to the way they were, something else often starts to shift. Not the tone this time, the story. The conversation can begin to change in a different way. This time it's not softer, it's subtler. You might be talking about something that happened, a disagreement, a comment, a pattern you've noticed, and the response sounds something like this. "That's not how it happened. You're remembering it wrong. You're taking that out of context. I never said that." At first, it can feel like a normal disagreement. After all, people do remember things differently. But over time, the differences start to stack up. You leave the conversation wondering, did I overreact? Did I misunderstand? Was I too sensitive? The facts begin to feel less steady. When someone feels they're losing control, controlling the story can become very important. Because if the story shifts, the responsibility shifts. And if the responsibility shifts, the balance of power can shift too. This doesn't always happen in loud or obvious ways. Sometimes it's just small corrections, small edits, small denials. But if you consistently walk away from conversations feeling unsure about what you clearly remember, that's important to notice. When the facts feel unstable, slow the conversation down. Clarity tends to return when the pace does. And if changing the story still doesn't restore the old dynamic, the energy in the conversation can rise. This is usually where things start to feel heavier. The emotion becomes stronger, not always explosive, but heavier. You might notice the message gets longer, the conversations last longer, the tone carries more weight. Instead of debating what happened, it starts to sound like, "How can you do this to me? After everything I've done for you, I can't believe you're treating me this way." Now, the focus isn't the issue anymore. It's the emotional impact. And that can be very powerful because strong emotion pulls for a response. You might even feel a sudden pressure to explain yourself more clearly, to calm things down, to reassure, to fix. The urgency can feel real, and sometimes the pain being expressed is real. But when emotional intensity rises sharply right after you've created distance, that shift matters. Strong emotion can create the feeling that something must be resolved immediately. But urgency doesn't always mean clarity. If you notice that conversations move quickly from discussion to distress, that's part of the pattern. And simply recognizing that shift can help you stay steady inside it. If strong emotion doesn't pull you back in, the pattern often becomes quieter, less dramatic, more frequent. And if you're listening to this and recognizing it in your own experience, you may know someone else who needs this kind of clarity too. Feel free to share it with them. Because sometimes simply understanding the pattern can make a difficult situation feel less overwhelming. If emotional intensity doesn't bring things back the way they were, something else often increases: contact. You might notice more messages than usual, more check-ins, more small reasons to reach out, a text about something minor, a call that just wanted to see how you're doing, a comment on something you posted, running into you more often than before. On their own, none of these things seems dramatic, but the frequency shifts, and that shift matters. When someone feels their influence decreasing, increasing pressure can feel like a way to stay connected. Not necessarily to resolve anything, but to remain in the conversation. You may start to feel like there's less space, less quiet, less room to think. And sometimes that constant contact can slowly pull you back into the same rhythm you were trying to step out of. When the pace of communication increases, it's worth noticing. You're allowed to set the pace. Healthy communication works best when it's mutual, not persistent. And if increased presence still doesn't restore closeness, the communication can take a very personal turn. This is often the part people struggle with the most. If warmth didn't restore things, and changing the story didn't work, and intensity didn't pull you back, and increased contact didn't close the gap, the tone can shift one more time. Now it feels deeply personal. You might hear something like, "I don't know what I'd do without you. You're the only person who really understands me. I'm not okay lately." There may be a sudden openness, conversations that feel raw, honest, emotional, or even a crisis that puts you back in the role of supporter. This is often the hardest stage to sort through because it doesn't feel manipulative. It feels vulnerable. And vulnerability can create closeness very quickly. When you step back and look at these shifts together, a pattern becomes clearer. And that clarity changes how you experience the conversation. When someone feels they're losing control, restoring attachment can restore influence because closeness brings access, and access brings leverage. That doesn't mean the feelings being expressed are fake, but timing still matters. If deep vulnerability shows up right as you were creating distance, that shift is worth noticing. You can care about someone and still stay clear about what's happening, because compassion and clarity don't cancel each other out. They can exist at the same time. When you begin to recognize these shifts, the sudden warmth, the changing story, the rising intensity, the increased contact, the deep pull of vulnerability, something subtle happens inside you. This situation may still feel complicated, but it no longer feels unpredictable. And that's what matters. Because when behavior follows patterns, it becomes easier to stay grounded in your own communication. You don't have to match urgency with urgency. You don't have to argue every version of events. You don't have to respond to every emotional wave. Awareness doesn't solve everything, but it stabilizes you. And stability is the foundation of effective communication. If this video offered you a higher level of clarity, you might find that this video right here can offer some more insight into narcissistic behaviors and what you can do about it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you there.